Welcome back to the channel. There's been a situation brewing in a small Italian town that nobody's really talking about yet, but it's starting to get messy. American expats are flooding into this place. Locals are getting frustrated, prices are shooting up, and there are some pretty heated debates happening in the town square about whether this is revitalizing a dying village or destroying its soul. The town is called Calcata, and it sits on a volcanic cliff about an hour north of Rome. We're talking medieval streets so narrow you can touch both walls, artists who've taken over abandoned cave houses, and a community that's part bohemian commune, part Renaissance fair, part expat experiment gone either wonderfully right or terribly wrong, depending on who you ask. I spent 2 weeks there digging into what's really happening, talking to the Americans who moved there, the locals who've watched their town transform, and the people caught in between. What I found was way more complicated than another feel-good expat story. So stick with me because we're going to count down the 7 reasons this bizarre little town has become ground zero for a very particular kind of American exodus, and some of these reasons are going to surprise you. We're not just talking cheap wine and pretty views here. Let's start with number 7 because this is where things get interesting right from the jump.
Number 7. It's the town that officially doesn't exist. Here's something they don't put in the tourism brochures. The medieval village of Calcata, the part everyone's moving to, was actually condemned by the Italian government in the 1930s. They declared the entire cliff geologically unstable and told everyone to evacuate to Calcata Nuova, the new town they built nearby. The old village was supposed to crumble into the valley and disappear. Except it didn't. And in the 1960s, artists from Rome started squatting in the abandoned stone houses. We're talking about painters, sculptors, writers, the kind of people who saw a condemned medieval village on a cliff and thought, yeah, that's perfect. They paid almost nothing, sometimes literally just moving into empty buildings. The Italian government sort of looked the other way because honestly, what were they going to do? The place was condemned anyway. Fast forward to today, and you've got this weird legal situation where many of the properties exist in a gray area. Some have been retroactively legalized, some haven't, and new buyers are walking into a situation where their dream Italian villa might technically be illegal to inhabit. One American couple I talked to, Karen and Robert from Oregon, bought their place in 2019 for what seemed like a steal at €90,000. 3 bedrooms, terrace, views of the valley. 6 months after moving in, they got a letter from the municipality questioning their residency permit because the building wasn't properly registered. "We thought we were being smart," Karen told me while we sat in her kitchen overlooking the gorge. "Everyone said get a lawyer, do your due diligence, and we did, but there are layers to the bureaucracy here that don't make sense until you're living it." They eventually sorted it out, but it cost them another €15,000 in legal fees and renovations to bring the property up to code. The thing is, for every story like Karen and Robert's, there are 5 more Americans who've had 0 problems. The inconsistency is part of what makes Calcata so chaotic right now. Nobody knows which rules will be enforced and when.
Number 6. The cost of living is shockingly low, but not for the reasons you think. When people hear Italy and cheap, they picture Tuscany for half the price. Calcata is cheaper than that. We're talking about a 1-bedroom apartment in the old village for €400 to €600 a month. A 2-bedroom house with original frescoed ceilings, maybe €750. You can eat lunch at the local osteria for €8 including wine. But here's the catch that nobody mentions in those move to Italy for cheap videos. Calcata is cheap because it's been economically depressed for decades. The new town, Calcata Nuova, where most actual Italians live, has an unemployment rate that hovers around 18%. The old village survived on tourism, which is seasonal and unreliable. When Americans started moving in with their remote work salaries and retirement funds, they brought money into an economy that desperately needed it. Sounds great, right?
Except now you've got a situation where a retired teacher from Wisconsin can outbid a local family for a house. Rents have doubled in 5 years in the old village. The few Italians who still wanted to live there are being priced out of their own town. I sat down with Marco, a guy in his 30s whose family has lived in Calcata for 4 generations. His grandmother still lives in the new town. He showed me listings on his phone. This one, my friend's parents owned it. They sold to Americans last year for $140,000. 5 years ago, you couldn't give that house for $70,000. Now I can't afford to live in the town where I was born. The economics are genuinely complicated. The Americans brought restaurants back from the brink of closure. They funded renovations that stopped buildings from literally collapsing. But they also fundamentally changed who can afford to live there. There's no easy villain in this story, which is exactly what makes it so tense.
Number 5. The community everyone raves about is incredibly insular, and not everyone gets in. If you read expat blogs about Calcata, you'll see the word community about 100 times per post. Potluck dinners, art walks, music festivals. It sounds like a utopia, and for the people who are part of it, it seems to be exactly that. But here's what nobody talks about. That community has gatekeepers, and if you don't fit the vibe, you're going to have a lonely time. Calcata's expat scene is dominated by artists, writers, musicians, yoga instructors, and spiritual seekers. If you show up as a retired accountant who likes golf and isn't interested in attending the solstice drum circle, you might find yourself on the outside looking in. I talked to 3 different American expats who moved there expecting the warm welcome they'd read about online and found themselves essentially ignored. One woman, Linda from Atlanta, moved there in 2021 after her husband passed away. She thought the community aspect would help with her grief. I went to every event, every dinner, every art opening. I tried. But if you're not part of the original crew or you don't have something artistic to offer, you're just kind of there. I ended up spending more time in Rome because at least there I didn't feel invisible. She moved back to the States after 14 months. On the flip side, I talked to a painter from Brooklyn named Jesse who moved there in 2018 and says it's the most supportive community he's ever experienced. These people saved my life. I was burnt out, broke, and ready to give up on art. Here, I have a studio. I sell my work. I collaborate with other artists. It's everything I needed. The difference, Jesse plugged into the art scene immediately. He contributed. He became part of the ecosystem. Linda didn't have that entry point, and nobody made space for her. It's not malicious exactly, it's just cliquey in a way that can be brutal if you're on the wrong side of it. Number 4. The locals aren't charming Italian villagers, they're exhausted. Here's the part of the expat fantasy that nobody wants to hear. The Italians in Calcata are tired. They're tired of explaining things. Tired of being treated like set dressing in someone else's adventure, and really tired of the constant questions about where to buy olive oil. I talked to a woman named Francesca, who runs a small shop in the old village, selling ceramics and local products. She's been there for 20 years, back when the village was still mostly empty. At first, the foreigners were interesting. They brought energy. But now, Number 4. The locals aren't charming Italian villagers, they're exhausted. Here's the part of the expat fantasy that nobody wants to hear. The Italians in Calcata are tired. They're tired of explaining things, tired of being treated like set dressing in someone else's adventure, and really tired of the constant questions about where to buy olive oil. I talked to a woman named Francesca, who runs a small shop in the old village, selling ceramics and local products. She's been there for 20 years, back when the village was still mostly empty. At first, the foreigners were interesting. They brought energy. But now, every day, someone asks me to explain the bus schedule, or where the post office is, or why their internet doesn't work. I'm not a tour guide. I'm trying to run a business. She said it politely, but the frustration was obvious. There's also a cultural clash that gets glossed over.
The Calcata's new expat population tends to be politically progressive, secular, and very vocal about things like environmentalism and social justice. The Italians in the surrounding area, especially the older generation, are often quite conservative and Catholic. These are not naturally aligned worldviews. One particularly uncomfortable incident happened last year during the town's religious festival honoring Saint Cornelius. A group of expats organized a counter-event promoting paganism and ancient goddess worship. It was meant to be respectful, a celebration of the area's pre-Christian history. The local priest and several Italian families saw it as a direct insult. "They come here and they want to change everything," an older Italian man told me outside the church. "They don't respect what we believe. They think we're backwards." I asked him if he thought the expats should leave. He paused. "No, we need them. The town was dying, but I wish they would just be more quiet about their ideas." That tension, that need for the economic benefits but resentment of the cultural imposition is simmering constantly.
Number 3. The infrastructure is crumbling and nobody wants to pay to fix it. Let's talk about something practical that sounds boring but is actually causing huge drama. The plumbing in Calcata is a disaster. The electrical systems are outdated and dangerous. The roads into the old village are barely wide enough for a compact car and they're pitted with holes. When it was just artists squatting in condemned buildings, nobody cared. Now that it's becoming a desirable expat destination, people expect things to work, and they don't. There's a battle happening right now, and it's gotten ugly. The municipality wants to do a major infrastructure overhaul, updating water lines, electrical grids, and the main access road. The estimated cost is around €2 million. They want to split it between the government, tourism funds, and property owners. Property owners, many of whom are now American, are furious. They argue they already paid for their houses and shouldn't be on the hook for municipal failures. The Italians argue that the foreigners bought cheap properties knowing there were issues and now want the government to fix everything for free. A town meeting last November that apparently devolved into shouting. One American expat reportedly stood up and said, "We are bringing money into this town. You should be grateful." An Italian woman responded, "You bought a house for less than a car, and now you want us to thank you?" The updates haven't happened yet. The compromise they're trying to work out involves a special property tax on homes in the old village, which has the expats threatening legal action, claiming it's discriminatory. Meanwhile, the sewage system is literally medieval in some parts. During heavy rains, raw sewage sometimes backs up into ground floor apartments. It's not charming, it's a health hazard.
Number 2. There's a growing scandal about Airbnb and what it's doing to the town. This is where things get really messy, and it's a problem that's blowing up in small towns across Europe. But Calcata is a particularly intense example. A lot of the Americans who bought cheap properties in Calcata don't actually live there full-time. They use them as vacation homes, or increasingly, as Airbnb rentals. The math makes sense. Buy a house for €100,000, spend €20,000 fixing it up, and rent it out for €150 a night. In the summer months, that house can generate €3,000–4,000 a month. Except now, the old village is becoming a rotating cast of tourists instead of an actual community. Longtime expats who moved there for the community vibe are watching it evaporate. Italians who tolerated the expats because at least they were neighbors now have strangers stumbling drunk through the alleys at 2 in the morning every weekend. The town has tried to regulate it. Last year, they passed a rule limiting short-term rentals to 90 days per year unless you have a commercial hospitality license, which is expensive and complicated to get. Several American owners just ignored the rule. The fines are small enough that it's cheaper to pay them than comply. There's one American landlord, I'm not going to name him because this is pending legal action, who owns 4 properties in Calcata and runs them all as full-time Airbnbs. He doesn't live in Italy. He has a management company handle everything. The locals despise him. His properties are some of the most profitable in town, and he's never had a conversation with a single neighbor. It's colonialism, one Italian artist told me bluntly. They take, they profit, they don't live here, they don't contribute, it's just extraction. The expat community is divided on this too. The ones who live there year-round are often just as angry as the Italians because the Airbnb investors are destroying the exact thing that made Calcata attractive in the first place. Number 1. Nobody knows what Calcata is supposed to be anymore, and that identity crisis is tearing it apart. All right, we've made it to the top reason, and it's the one that ties everything else together. Calcata is having an existential crisis, and nobody can agree on what the town should become. Is it a living museum, an artist colony, a budget retirement destination for Americans, a tourist attraction, a regular Italian town trying to survive? The answer is it's trying to be all of those things at once, and it's not working. There are roughly 300 people living in the old village now, and they fall into roughly 3 camps. You've got the original Italian families, maybe 20% of the population, who want Calcata to stay Italian and quiet. You've got the old guard expats, the artists and hippies who've been there since the 70s and 80s, who want it to stay weird and bohemian. And you've got the new wave of expats, retirees and remote workers from the last 5 years, who want it to be functional and comfortable. These groups don't want the same thing. The Italians want the religious festivals respected and the bars to close at a reasonable hour. The old guard wants freedom to do spontaneous art installations and host late-night music sessions. The new expats want reliable Wi-Fi and a grocery store that's open on Sundays. The result is constant low-level conflict. Every town decision becomes a referendum on what Calcata is. When they debated whether to allow a small supermarket to open, it split the town. The new expats and some Italians wanted it desperately. The old guard artists said it would ruin the charm and turn Calcata into just another town. The supermarket opened, but the owner, an Italian guy from the new town, got harassed so much by a few vocal old guard expats that he almost closed after 6 months. They accused him of selling out, of catering to the Americans, of destroying the village's soul. He was just trying to sell vegetables. What I realized after 2 weeks there is that Calcata is a microcosm of a much bigger tension happening all over Europe. What happens when the economics that keep a place alive fundamentally changes its culture? Can a town preserve its identity while also evolving to survive? And who gets to decide what that identity is? The Americans moving to Calcata genuinely love it. They're not villains. Most of them are respectful, curious, and trying to integrate. But their presence, their money, and their expectations are changing the place whether they intend to or not. The Italians aren't wrong to feel invaded. Their town is unrecognizable compared to 20 years ago, but it was also dying 20 years ago. Without the expats, Calcata might genuinely be rubble by now. The old guard expats want to preserve a version of Calcata that only existed because it was ignored and condemned. That bohemian freedom came from neglect, not design. You can't keep that and also have investment and infrastructure. There's no resolution to this, not yet anyway. The arguments continue. The town council meetings are packed and tense. Facebook groups devoted to Calcata are war zones of passive-aggressive posts and angry manifestos. But here's the thing, and this is what makes the story worth paying attention to. Calcata is figuring out in real time what happens when the dream of affordable, beautiful, simple life abroad crashes into the reality of displacement, economic inequality, and cultural friction. It's happening in Portugal, in Mexico, in Croatia, in dozens of places where remote work and retirement savings can buy a lifestyle that locals can't afford. Calcata just happens to be small enough and weird enough that all the contradictions are right on the surface. You can't hide them in a village of 300 people on a cliff. So, what's going to happen? Honestly, I don't know. Maybe they'll find a balance. Maybe the tension will boil over and half the expats will leave. Maybe the Italians will sell the rest of their properties and the town will become entirely foreign-owned. Maybe the cliff will actually collapse like the government predicted in the 1930s, and the whole argument will become moot. What I do know is this: if you're thinking about moving to a town like Calcata, you need to go in with your eyes open. It's not a postcard, it's a real place with real problems, and your presence will change it. That's not necessarily bad, but it's also not neutral. You're not just moving to Italy, you're becoming part of a complicated, ongoing story, and you don't get to control how it ends. If you found this deep dive into Calcata interesting, hit that subscribe button because we're going to keep digging into these real, messy stories about expat life that nobody else is talking about. And drop a comment. I want to know. If you were moving to a town like Calcata, what would be your red line? What would make you say, okay, this isn't worth it? Because I'm genuinely curious where people draw that line. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.